Hello and welcome to English Pro Tips. In today's video, we're going to be looking at 5 key phrases that you can use in Academic Task 1 to help you get a higher score in your IELTS writing. Now for this video, we're going to be using this. It's a Academic Task 1 question, and the rubric says, the 3 pie charts below show the proportion of electric, hybrid, electric and petrol and diesel vehicles registered in Norway in 2008, 2018, and a prediction for 2028. And the task, which is always the same, will say, summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Now, what I always tell my students is spend the first 2 to 4 minutes analyzing the graphic before you start writing. And that's what we're going to do now. So we can see we have 4 different categories, 4 different vehicle types. We have fully electric, hybrid, diesel and petrol, and we have 3 different dates, 2008, 2018 and 2028, which is a prediction. Now in our answer we want to make sure we're mentioning all of these. So let's have a look at what happens overall to each of these categories. Well, fully electric vehicles don't appear in 2008, but they grow in 2018 to 4%, and they grow a lot more again, or they're expected to grow by 2028. For hybrid vehicles, we have a similar situation. They're just 1% in 2018, 11% in 2018, and in 2028 they're predicted to be 30%. What about diesel? Well, we can see it starts at 30% in 2008. By 2018 they've grown to 46%, but by 2028 they're expected to shrink. But overall they shrink between 2008 and 2028. And finally, petrol vehicles, well, they start as the largest category in 2008 at 69%. They shrink in 2018 and they're expected to decrease by 2028. Okay. So now that we've got a general understanding of what the graphic is and what information is in this graphic, let's now look at some of the key phrases that we can use in our answer. Now, the first one might be obvious, but it is very important, and that is overall. Now, we use overall to introduce our overview. Now, if you don't know what an overview is, it's something you definitely need to learn soon before you do your IELTS writing test. It's basically a general description of the graphic. Let's have a look at an example. Overall, from 2008 to 2018, the percentage of hybrid and fully electric vehicles on Norwegian roads increased significantly, though this positive trend was offset by the predominance of petrol and diesel vehicles. However, by 2028, this situation is projected to reverse substantially, with green tech vehicles surpassing fossil-fueled ones to become Norway's dominant means of conveyance. Okay, let's look at the word overall in a bit more detail. First of all, why should we include overall in our answer? It clearly shows the examiner that you have an overview in your answer. Now, an overview is very important for getting a high score in IELTS writing. From the public band descriptors, we can see that it's very difficult to get a band 6 in task achievement if you don't have an overview. And at band 7 and above, you need to have a clear overview. So, if you want to learn a bit more about how to write overviews, then have a look at EnglishProTips.com and you can have a look at our full IELTS course. The important thing is that you have a lot of practice writing overviews, so when it comes to doing your exam, you feel totally prepared. Now, what do we need to remember when writing overall? Well, remember the comma. We use a comma after overall, and we can see an example here. Overall, comma, and then we have our overview. Okay, let's move on to the next word in today's lesson. We have meaning that, or this means that. Okay, let's have a look at some examples. The share of fully electric vehicles is predicted to increase to 32%, meaning that it will be the most common vehicle type in 2028. The share of fully electric vehicles is predicted to continue increasing, rising from 4% to 32%. This means that fully electric vehicles will be the most common vehicle type in 2028. Now, why are these phrases useful for academic task 1? Well, it clearly shows the examiner that you have analysed the graphic. Again, if you're looking for one of those high scores, 7, 8 or 9 in IELTS writing, you really need to be making comparisons and analysing the data in the graphic. You can't simply mechanically formulate or mechanically report the data. What do we need to remember? Well, we put a comma before meaning that, and you can see an example here in this sentence. We also have a clause, a subject and a verb after meaning that. So in this sentence we can say, meaning that it will be the most common vehicle type in 2028. This means that is slightly different. We use this mean that at the beginning of a new sentence to give information about the previous sentence. And here's an example. Okay, let's move on. The third phrase that we're going to look at in today's lesson is respectively. Now, respectively means in the order mentioned, and it's quite typical in scientific papers or papers with a lot of data, which is quite typical in academic task 1. Let's have a look at some examples. In 2028, the proportion of fully electric and hybrid vehicles is expected to increase to 32% and 30% respectively. Now, by putting respectively here at the end of the sentence, it means that 32% refers to the proportion of fully electric vehicles and 30% refers to the proportion of hybrid vehicles. Let's have a look at another example. In 2028, the share of diesel and petrol vehicles is predicted to decrease by 19% and 28% respectively. Again, this means that 19% refers to diesel vehicles and 28% refers to petrol vehicles. Now, notice that the second sentence has a comma. Now, there's debate over whether respectively needs a comma in these kind of sentences. Our advice would be to write the comma. It doesn't cause any more confusion, and most people agree that it's grammatically correct to put a comma before respectively. However, let us know what you think. Okay. Why should we use respectively in our answers? Well, first of all, it's advanced vocabulary. It's C1 level vocabulary on the Common European Framework, which means it's roughly band 7, 8, or band 7 or 8 for IELTS vocabulary, which you're scored under Lexis. It's also a good way to include a lot of data in our answers in one sentence. And this can help us to finish our answers and finish our reports more quickly. When it comes to using respectively, remember we use respectively to give data about 2 or more categories. We wouldn't use respectively if we're just reporting the data from one category. And here is our example sentence again. Okay, let's move on now to the fourth word, which is, how would you pronounce this word? We pronounce it albeit. Now, you may have seen this word before in writing, but you probably haven't heard this word. And that's because this word, albeit, is much more common in writing than speaking. So you wouldn't usually use it in your speaking test or in your everyday conversations, but it can be very useful for task 1 and task 2 of IELTS. Okay, what does albeit mean? Well, it's a bit like although or nevertheless. We usually use it when we have, say, a positive statement and then we want to add maybe a slight contrast. So for example, I could say, Paris is a beautiful city, albeit expensive. So I'm saying that Paris is beautiful, a positive statement, albeit expensive, which is a negative statement. Let's have a look at how we can use it referring to this task. By 2028, the proportion of hybrid vehicles is expected to increase, albeit not as much as fully electric vehicles. And another sentence. By 2028, the share of diesel vehicles is expected to decrease, albeit not as much as petrol vehicles. Okay, so why should we use albeit in our answers? First of all, it's C2 level vocabulary. So if you remember, respectively was C1 level, which was round about 7 or 8 for IELTS, band 7 or 8 that is. So albeit is C2 level, which is more typical of band 8 or 9 vocabulary. It also prevents us from using however too often in our answers. Many of our answers have however, but in IELTS we want to show a range of different contrasting words and a range of different linkers, and albeit can replace however. Sometimes, not all the time. It's also a good way to show comparisons between the data. You remember that the graphic or the task asks you to summarize the information and to make comparisons. So when we use a word like albeit, we're showing the examiner that we can make comparisons of data. What to remember? Put a comma before albeit. And then we have albeit plus an adjective, adverb, or a noun clause, but not a verb clause. Here's an example. By 2028, the proportion of hybrid vehicles is expected to increase, albeit not as much as fully electric vehicles. Okay, the final word is compared to. Compared to petrol vehicles, compared to petrol vehicles, hybrid vehicles made up a very small proportion of the vehicles registered in Norway in 2008. I think this sentence says vehicles too many times, but that's okay. By 2028, just 28% of vehicles will run on diesel, compared to 46% in 2018. So here we have the first example sentence, which has compared to at the beginning, and then another example sentence, which has compared to in the middle of the sentence. Now, again, why would we use compared to? Well, it's advanced grammar when we use compared to at the beginning of a sentence. And that's because it's a subordinate clause. It also shows the examiner that you are making comparisons between the categories. And, well, we explained why that's important. What do we need to remember? Put a comma after compared to plus a noun. Compared to petrol vehicles, hybrid vehicles made up a very small proportion of the vehicles registered in Norway in 2008. When we have compared to in the middle of a sentence, we just need the comma before. By 2028, just 28% of vehicles will run on diesel, comma, compared to 46% in 2018. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video, and let me know, do you think you'll be using any of these phrases, or do you already use some of these phrases in your Task 1 practice essays? Best of luck with all of your studies, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye then.